There was no logic to where I put my cue points. Because it was so random, it took ages. And it meant when it came time to mix, I could never remember what the cue points were for, causing my mixes to flop. That's when I realized I needed to put in place an actual system for setting my cues. In this video, I'm going to show you this simple 4-step cue system that can be applied to any track in any DJ software. And I've been using this successfully for about 5 years now on thousands of tracks. It's sped up my prep, track understanding, and boosted creativity in my sets. I'm Chris and I've been DJing for over 20 years, and on this channel I help DJs get the most out of their DJ software and their music libraries. When you're performing, the last thing you want to do is spend time remembering what your cues are for. Just like a traffic light, we can use colour as a shortcut for meaning. Let's set a hot cue here on the drop of this track. By default, this will be green in Rekordbox. But by right-clicking on the hot cue, you can select a colour. Here's one colour system I've used in the past. Green for the start of the intro, orange for vocal sections, red for the drops, and purple for the outro. Ultimately, you can use whatever colours you want, but there are a few things to be aware of before you start throwing paint. If you're planning to play on club gear, then many older CDJs like the CDJ 2000 don't support coloured hot cues. And depending what kind of controller you've got, the performance pads might not change colour. There are also over 2 billion people in the world that suffer with some kind of colour blindness. To use it to its full potential, we need to combine it with step 2 of the system. One of the main goals of setting up a system in the first place is to reduce thinking time while you're actually DJing. This reduces stress when you're playing in front of a crowd and also opens up the doors to faster transitions. If you've got no logic to what cue point slot is used for what, it's going to make mixing smoothly really tricky. Let's look at why this ordering can cause problems. On this track, I've set 2 cues. The first hot cue is on the drop, and the second one is on the intro. On this track, I've set 3 cues. As I was scanning through, I found a cool vocal part and put my first cue on it. Then I went back to find the drop and put my second cue there. Then finally, I found the intro and added a third cue. Doesn't sound so bad, right? We've got cues on all the interesting parts of the track. The problem here is the lack of consistency between which cue we're putting in which slot. On track 1, the drop is on hot cue 1, but on the other track, it's in hot cue 2. This can add a lot of thinking time, especially if you're less familiar with the track. And that limits your ability to do fast transitions or even to audition multiple tracks before you have to mix in. It's kind of like hopping on a train and not knowing what order the stations are going to be in. Luckily, this is easy to fix. I made a free worksheet you can use that you can download in the description. On the worksheet, simply write out what you want to use each cue slot for. If you want, you can also add a colour here. Then stick it on your wall in front of where you do your track prep and get it memorised. In my cue point system, I use these slots. Q1 is 16 bars before the first drop. The second cue is 8 bars before, and Q3 is the drop itself. Q4 is more of an optional performance one, and I use it to mark things like vocals or interesting samples. And by the way, this works for memory cues as well. Now we've written down our ordering and our colouring, and all you need to do now is apply this consistently to every track. This will free you up to focus on performing rather than trying to remember what your cues are actually for. But speaking of performing, what if you use your cues more for that than marking track structure? Babies are just small angry potatoes your friends pretend to care about. That's why traditionally parents give them names to make them more appealing to commoners. Naming your cue points can also be really useful in a few scenarios. Identifying vocal phrases, samples, or even writing notes to yourself about a track where it's got something slightly unusual. To add a name to a cue point in Rekordbox, just right-click the cue point, select Add Comment, and type something in. Try and keep this short. You can also name memory cues. To rename those in performance mode, you've got to right-click on the cue. In export mode, click next to the memory cue timestamp and type it in. I see naming as more of an optional part of the system. I only use it when there's something unique about that particular cue point. For example, I wouldn't waste time naming every drop cue point. That's because I've already got ordering and colouring rules in place, which means I don't need a label to identify it's a drop. At this point, we've created a pretty solid cue point system. It's coloured, it's ordered, and where relevant, it's named. That leaves one final question. How many of these things do we actually need to set? When I first moved from vinyl to digital DJing, it was like Christmas. I went from having 1 cue point to 16, and you better believe I used all of them. There was pretty much a cue on every beat of the track. But I soon realised I didn't want to spend my life setting cues. I wanted to be on the decks. As time went on and I got more familiar with DJing and my gear, I started setting less cue points in advance. But to know how many you should set, you need to do a bit of self-reflection on how you DJ. I've come up with a few different templates for different kinds of DJing that you can use as a starting point. See which one sounds like you and let me know in the comments. You're probably a blender if your transitions last 45 seconds plus. You usually mix intros with outros, generally play the same genre, and you tell your friends your sets like journeys, unironically. Your transitions are simple but effective, so aim for around 2 to 4 cues. You're probably a double dropper if you get through 50 plus tracks in 30 minutes. There's rarely one track playing by itself for more than 15 seconds. Creating bass faces is your main goal, and you're covered in sweat by the end of your set. You'll probably need about 4 to 6 cues spread across the track to allow fast mixing. You're probably a performer if you like using every single feature on your deck or controller. You love using acapellas and samples for interesting transitions. Genre is meaningless to you, and your dream is to win the DMC championships even though you've only been able to baby scratch for the last 15 years. You'll probably have a wide variety of different cue point types, so you may need 6 plus. As your DJing style changes and evolves, so will the amount of cue points you need to set. If you find you're not using particular cues regularly, then look at removing them from your system over time. But before you do any of this, it's essential to make sure your library is built on a solid foundation so you're not wasting time prepping tracks you never even play. In this video, I show you some easy ways to declutter your library in Rekordbox.